Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we're doing a BIOS deep dive into the ASUS H610M-K D4. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at the BIOS on the ASUS H610M-K D4. This is a kind of budget entry-level board on the Intel 12th or 13th gen platform. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of interest in this board and people wanting to know what they can actually do in the BIOS and how to set up certain things like XMP, drive boot orders, all those kinds of things. So let's get this thing fired up. We'll head on into the BIOS and take a look. Okay, so let's head on into the BIOS. So this, as you can see, is an AMI BIOS by American Megatrends Incorporated. And as you can see, this is the ASUS Prime H610M-K D4 ACPI BIOS revision 0401. And the CPU is the 12th gen Intel Core TM i3-12100 with a rated speed of 4100 MHz. Device memory is showing currently as 16 gigs and it's showing keyboards, mouse, etc. Message on the screen, new CPU installed. Please enter setup to configure your system. You'll basically see this whenever you install your processor for the first time. It does also give a reference there to the ASUS Performance enhancement option, APE for short. So in the BIOS, if you wish to follow Intel's guidelines and apply the stock power limits, you can do that, or you can turn on APE in the BIOS apparently. When you're ready, press F1 to continue. So here is our UEFI BIOS. This is currently in easy mode, so quick tour. Top left hand corner, information about the board and BIOS revision and also the processor type, etc. Pretty much what we've seen already. Underneath that we've got our DRAM status, so it's recognised correctly, our V-Color 8GB DRAM sticks. XMP is underneath that. As you can see, it's currently disabled, so if you want to enable XMP, which I would suggest you do, although you possibly won't get the full speed out of them depending on your processor, but to enable it, just click on there and click enabled, and it will try and use DDR4 3600, although realistically it's probably going to be limited to possibly 2933 or 2666, again depending on your processor. Also got your fan profiles here, so it shows that there isn't a chassis fan connected and the CPU fan is currently rotating at approximately 1000 RPM. In this top section we've got our CPU temperature. It's currently idling at a rather nice 33 degrees Celsius in a 26 degree room. Motherboard temperature is currently at 27 degrees. Got your CPU core voltage. System fan tuning is here, so you've got option for normal, power saving, or normal. Not a lot of options there, so you can't really do much else other than normal. Obviously, if you want to choose power saving, you certainly can do. Down at the bottom here, we've got the CPU fan, so QFan control. So let's quickly head into QFan control. So you can go into QFan tuning. If you click on that, it will go ahead and test the fan to see what its high and low points are. You can do that for both fan headers. And also you've got the option for standard, silent, turbo, full speed, or manual. So if you wish to apply a manual curve, then you can just move these around however you see fit. And then you can apply those changes. So I'm going to leave it set to silent. So that is QFan control, so we can escape out of there. So that is pretty much it for this section here. You've got the boot menu as well, F8, so we do F8. Currently we don't have any drives actually attached, so nothing to see there, but obviously you will find your drives that are attached and you can choose which one is your boot option or boot device, all those kinds of things. So let's go into our advanced mode. So in advanced mode, you've got the option for my favorites, main, AI tweaker, advanced monitor, boot, tool, and exit. And we'll divide these up, so there is going to be chapters in the video so you can go through. So in the main, obviously, we're just going over again pretty much what we've seen already. A little bit more detail on the BIOS date and build sections, all that kind of stuff. PCH step-ins, a bit more information there. Got security, so you can go into security and you can choose a password for the motherboard, user passwords, all that kind of stuff should you wish to. So that is main. Let's go into AI tweaker. There's not going to be a great deal we can do in here because this is an H610 board. So in terms of overclocking abilities, we've got our XMP profiles, which we can choose. You've got your XMP settings there. Your ASUS Performance enhancement, that is currently enabled. I would suggest leaving that enabled if you want to get the most out of your processor. If you choose disabled, it will adhere to Intel's limits in power overclocking, all that kind of stuff. Also, you've got your B clock frequency, so your DRAM frequency ratio. I would suggest leaving that set to auto unless you have a reason not to. And the same for the DRAM frequency memory controller. DRAM frequency, as you can see at the moment, is currently set to DDR4 3200 MHz, so it's dropped it down from our XMP, which was DDR 3600 down to 3200, which it should quite easily boot at. You can, if you want to, you can go in and change those after and see if it will do anything a little bit higher, but I would suggest possibly sticking with what it comes up as defaults, unless you are planning on to overclock a little bit further. Also got performance core ratio, so in there you can choose auto, single cores or bi-core usage. For most processors on this board, I would suggest auto would be your best bet. And then you've got your AVX related controls here. So AVX2 you can set to auto, enabled or disabled. And you've also got DRAM timing control, so you can take manual control of your DRAM timing, CAS latencies, and all those kinds of things should you want to. Again, you may be able to tweak a little bit more system performance out of it, although Intel systems in general aren't heavily affected by memory frequencies and timings, unlike the AMD counterparts. So moving down, we've got our Digi Plus VRM, so this is a load line calibration. You can set to basically whichever you choose to. Auto is generally going to be the best unless you have a reason not to. Level 4 is going to be recommended for overclock, so you could leave that if you wanted to. Again, auto might be the better option. You've got your sync AC/DC load line with VRM load line. You can have that enabled or disabled. CPU power phase control, auto, standard or extreme. Again, for moderate processors, I would say leave all this to auto. If you're running a higher end processor on this board, you've probably picked the wrong board, to be fair, because the VRMs aren't particularly good. So you may struggle to actually get any real performance updates out of this or enhancements. If you choose to have the CPU VRM thermal control disabled, you may find in certain instances that may give you a little bit more horsepower, but at the risk of overheating your VRMs. Next up, we've got internal CPU power management. So again, lots more settings here, lots of things you can change. So you've got IVR transmitter VDDQ, ICC max, so you can change that if you want to. A lot of these things in here, I'll be completely honest, I do not understand. With most of these things, it's probably best left set to auto unless you want to specifically look at a particular setting and see if it will improve things for you. Again, realistically, for most lower end parts, you're probably not going to see a great deal of performance improvement unless you kind of spend a lot of time and effort on it. Realistically, you're probably just going to get better performance by simply upgrading your CPU cooler rather than tweaking these settings in here. So all the limits you've got there, package time windows, etc., you can change all that stuff. Again, you can play with this to your heart's content. There's so many things here. It's actually probably a little bit too much considering what type of board this is. Next up, you've got Tweaker's Paradise. So you've got real-time memory timing. So you can choose that enabled or disabled. SPT write disable. PVD ratio thresholds. Again, a lot of this stuff in here I genuinely do not understand. Whether or not any of this is useful, please let me know in the comment section below. This guide is basically designed as a kind of a walkthrough, so if you're potentially considering buying this board, you can see what features are available and what can be tweaked. This isn't a guide on actually how to tweak processors or performance. So moving on down, we've got the minimum CPU cache ratio, max CPU graphics ratio, so you can change those sort of things there, put in particular settings should you wish to. CPU core cache voltage, graphics voltage, system agent voltage, and CPU input voltage, DRAM voltage, PCH 1.8 primary, and your DRAM ref voltage control, so all those options there. I would imagine a lot of this, if you do change them, they're just going to revert back to auto anyway, because the fact that the board is quite limited, but certainly if you want to play with any of those, you certainly can do. Next up, we're going to advanced, so we've got, first of all, a platform miscellaneous configuration. So you've got your PCI Express native power management, your native ASPM, your PCH to PCI Express links. You can change those settings there should you wish to. Again, a lot of this stuff, just leave it as it is. And you've got PCI Express clock gating there, which you can enable or disable. Next up, you've got CPU configurations. So you've got performance core information there, basically just detailed information about your CPU states or what is supported. Something else we can change at the bottom is the hardware prefetcher. You've got adjacent cache line prefetch, Intel VMX virtualization technology, so this is virtualization. You've also got active performance cores, so if you want to, you can choose how many cores are enabled. This is only a 4-core processor, 4 cores, 8 threads, so you've got option for all 3, 2 or 1. Obviously if you've got a 6-core, then you'll have more options there. 8-core, you'll have more. You get the general idea. Hyperthreading, you've got that set to enabled, so if you want to disable hyperthreading, you could turn that into disabled. That will leave you with just 4 cores and obviously less threads, so 4 cores, 4 threads. Certain instances may require that. And you've got CPU power management control, so you can go into there, boot performance mode, you've got auto, Intel speed step, I would probably leave that enabled. Speed shift technology, I would leave that enabled as well. Turbo mode, obviously, yeah, you want to have that enabled unless you're having problems with some form of throttling, in which case you could disable that if you wanted to. Acoustic noise settings, so you can go into there and you've got acoustic noise mitigation. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure what this is, to be honest with you. I'm imagining it's something to do with possibly fan speeds or something, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to have to look that one up. Don't know what that is at all, if I'm completely honest. CPU C states, so you've got set to auto, disabled or enabled, so you can enable certain C states which are available. Enhanced C states there, so you can choose enabled or disabled. Package C state limit, you can set to auto, or you've got your C0, C2, etc., all those kinds of things there. You can set to CPU default. Thermal monitor, you can have enabled or disabled. And dual tau boost, you can choose to have that enabled or disabled. So after that, we've got the system agent configuration. So you go there, it tells you about virtualization, etc. You can enable or disable. And also your IONMU. Memory configuration, so you can choose to have a memory remap should you want to. Graphics configuration, you've got your primary display. This is probably going to be the most useful for a lot of people. So if you've got a graphics card installed as well, you may want to change that to your PCIe or PC Express graphics slot or CPU graphics. So depending on how you're set up, how you're running it. Generally, if you set it to auto, it should be absolutely fine. But if you're getting problems with you're not getting into Windows or certain parts of Windows don't work properly or whatever, then you can choose to have that enabled, disabled, or basically just choose whichever type of graphics you want. So you've got iGPU multi-monitor, you can have enabled or disabled, so that's pretty self-explanatory. DVMT pre-allocated, so this is the amount of memory which is pre-allocated to your onboard graphics. This is something which some of you may want to take a look at. Generally, I would say leave it either set to auto if it's available, depending on your BIOS revision, or just set it to the maximum available. So that's going to be 512 megabytes. You've also got RC6, which is render standby. I would leave that enabled as well. That will give you better performance. Next up, we've got the VMD setup menu. So you can enable or disable that option. As standard, it's enabled, so I would leave it unless you have a reason not to. Then you've got your PCI Express configuration. So this is going to be for your PCI Express 16 link. So in certain instances, if you have an older graphics card and you've also got perhaps an M.2 drive or some SATA drives, sometimes newer graphics cards or even older graphics cards can present problems. So you can specifically choose the generation of the actual slot itself. So it's only a Gen 4 slot. It does give you the option for Gen 5. Whether or not that would accept a Gen 5 card, I honestly don't know, because I don't have a Gen 5 card to use. But if you're using an older graphics card, like an old GTX 1650 or something, then you could set this to Gen 3 if you wanted to. Again, I would probably leave it to auto, but if you have a reason to, if you're getting issues, maybe blue screening or graphical errors, that sort of stuff, you may want to choose the appropriate generation for your graphics card. So next up, we've got our PCH configuration. So this is your PCI Express. So again, this is link speeds. This is going to be for your PCI Express ×1 port, which is down lower. And also for your M.2 speed. So you can choose, obviously, generational, which you want for your link speed. And if you've got maybe an older PCI Express card, which is playing up, again, you can choose. Most of the time, those are going to be fine set to auto. PCH storage, so this is your SATA controllers. You can choose to enable or disable. So if you don't have SATA drives, you can obviously disable that. Aggressive LPM support, you can choose to, this is basically for power states, to power down I would leave that set to disabled unless you particularly want to save a lot of power. Smart self-test, enabled or disabled. Then you've got the options for your SATA ports there, so whether they're enabled or disabled, and also hot plug status. Generally you'll find hot plug is disabled because Windows generally doesn't support hot plug, at least for SATA drives, especially for boot drives, that's for sure. So you've got the 4 SATA ports there. Next you've got your PCH FW, so this is to turn on TPM. So you can enable firmware TPM, so if you're planning on installing Windows 11, you will need to enable firmware TPM. If you've got a separate plug-in TPM device which plugs into the TPM header, then you can choose your discrete TPM. Discrete basically just means separate or additional. So yeah, choose firmware. It gives you the warning about the hardware TPM implementation, blah blah. If you lose the key, basically you're screwed, or it won't boot, or files which are encrypted will not be unencrypted. So yeah, do pay attention to that. Only enable TPM if you really need to. Next up, we've got trusted computing. So this is going to be for basically secure boot, that kind of stuff. You can choose to enable or disable it, and also disable the onboard TPM. So if you get rid of that, basically that disables TPM as well. You've also got all of your keys and storage there, so you can basically reset things if you want to. And it tells you your TPM UEFI spec version, which is installed. You can, if you want to, change it to the older version, but 2 is the more modern one, so I would leave it set to that. Again, if you're installing Windows 11, you're pretty much going to have to. Next up, PCI subsystem. So this is above 4G decoding. You also got resizable bar support, so you can enable that if you've got a graphics card which supports resizable bar, and you've got the SR IOV support. So this is basically if you've got serial devices or PCI Express devices which you want to enable within a virtual machine, you want to sort of pass them through, then you can choose to enable or disable that. USB configuration, so there's not a lot to choose here. So you've got legacy USB support. If you want to be able to use a USB keyboard and mouse in older type applications, or maybe in some form of emulation, a DOS prompt, that kind of stuff, then you want to have legacy USB support enabled. And you've got the XE HI handoff, which is kind of basically the same sort of thing. USB single port control, so you can, if you want to, you can enable or disable the individual USB ports, both USB 3 and USB 2. So if you want to disable ports, you can do, to prevent employees or users plugging in USB devices and transferring data, that kind of stuff. They're all set to enabled as default. Next up, network stack configuration. So you've got your network stack, you can have either enabled or disabled. That's for the UEFI, basically that's for kind of booting via your network. NVMe configuration, so we don't actually have a drive actually installed, so there's no information there, but there is a single NVMe port on the board. HDD smart information, again, because we don't have any drives installed, it's not going to come up with any information there, so we can ignore that. APM, so this is your power management, so restore after AC power loss. You can choose power on, last state, or power off. I would leave it to power off unless you have a specific reason. Otherwise, maybe if it's a server and you want it to power back on, realistically you probably should have a UPS if it's a server, but yeah, you can choose power on if you want to. Max power saving, I would leave that disabled, again, unless you have a specific reason or you have a local authority which requires you to do so. ERP as well, I would leave that disabled. That is basically power management as well. It will reduce power usage wherever possible. With this kind of system, especially on the H610 platform on lower end Intel processors, you want to try and squeeze as much performance out of it as you can. So turning on power management and power saving is going to reduce your performance overall. You also got power on by PCI Express, which you can have enabled if you want to. Power on by real-time clock. So if you choose enabled, you can go in and tell basically the system to turn on at a certain time. Some people may find that useful. Generally it's set to disabled. Onboard devices configuration, so this is your HD audio, so if you're using a separate USB DAC or separate sound card, you can disable the onboard audio should you wish to. The Realtek LAN controller, which is the gigabit LAN controller, you can again choose enabled or disabled if you want to. USB power delivery in soft off state, this is probably going to be useful for some people, so if you do want to have your devices charging, such as maybe your wireless mouse or your mobile phone, if you've got those connected on USB and you want power delivery while the system is in a kind of standby state or a power off state, then you can choose that enabled or disabled. QLED core, this is actually quite an interesting one. So the power button, when you actually wire up your power button, or a power button LED I should say, to the motherboard, there is an option of having it do almost like a DLED bug thing. So if the system power button flashes slowly, or flashes fast, or turns on, turns off, then that will give you a hint of what is actually wrong with your system if it doesn't power on. If the system's working normally, the power button LED will just work as normal. But that's quite an interesting feature. So they've basically taken the DLEDs off the motherboard and put it onto your case, essentially. RGB strip lighting control, you can set to on or off. I wasn't sure if this board actually has RGB, but yes, it does appear to have 12 volt RGB, not addressable RGB. M.2 configuration, you can choose for whether the port on the board, there's only a single port, but you can choose whether it automatically detects the drive which is being used, whether it's going to be a SATA port or whether it's going to be a PCI Express NVMe. I would probably leave that to auto unless you have a reason not to. Also, you've got the option here to enable or disable GNA devices. I would leave that as disabled unless you have a reason not to. Forgot that one. Serial port configuration. There is a serial port on here. There is a header on there. I would disable that unless you have a reason to. It's just another resource that you don't necessarily need. So that is it for onboard devices. Then you've got the Intel Rapid Store technology. You can enable that if you wanted to. Gives you information about it in the moment. And that is it for advanced. Let's go over to monitor. So temperature monitor, you can monitor the temperatures of the CPU, CPU package, and motherboard temperature. Not a great deal of information there, but might be useful. Fan speed monitor, again, same sort of deal. Voltage monitor gives you a readout of your voltages. So if you're having issues with the system, maybe it's the power supply not providing enough juice, you can have a quick check on your voltages in the BIOS there. So the core voltage is where you'd expect it to be. 12 volt voltage, 12.192, so that's fine, it's not under 12 volts. 5 volt is slightly over 5, that's good. 3.3 is slightly over again, so yeah, absolutely fine. DRAM voltage is currently showing 1.2. It will be 1.35 after a reboot. Next up is QFan. So again, we've seen this pretty much before. So you've got QFan tune-in, so detect the high and low points, very much like it did in the section a little bit earlier. You've got your fan profile, so silent, standard, turbo, full speed or manual. You've also got CPU step up times, step down times, and the CPU fan load limit. Then you've got chassis fan configuration, so you can go in and choose that. So whether or not it's DC mode, PWM mode, all that kind of stuff. Again, profiles for that as well. There's only one header on the board, so there's not a great deal to do there. So that's it for a monitor. And then you've got boot, so you can tune it. So you can choose in here CSM or compatibly support module. If you've got an older hard drive which you're upgrading from, so maybe you've got an old Windows 10 system and you just replace the motherboard and processor, you may want to enable CSM. If your boot device or your drives are not supported or not visible, that is the difference between MBR and GPT style formatted drives. Generally, I wouldn't enable that unless you absolutely have to. Secure boot, again, if you're using Windows 11, then you can choose here Windows UEFI mode for the OS type, and you can choose standard for secure boot type. Then you've also got key management and all that kind of stuff. Again, choose whichever is relevant to your particular operating system. Boot configuration, so you've got the option for fast boot, which you can enable or disable. I generally disable that. Boot logo display, option for on or off. Post delay time, numlock state on or off. That's quite handy, I suppose, for some people if you've got a 10 keyless keyboard or something. Wait for F1 if an error. I would generally have that enabled, just so if there is a problem, you have to press F1 to get into the system. Option ROM messages, you've got that option there. And also you've got your interrupt captures. AMI native NVMe driver support, that's enabled as default. I'd leave that left on. And setup mode, when you go into your BIOS to begin with, you've got the option for either advanced mode or easy mode. So you can choose between the two of those. Next up is tools. So you've got the ASUS Easy Flash 3 utility. So that is for flashing the BIOS. You've also got the option for BIOS image rollback support. I would leave that enabled. So if you flash a BIOS which is a little bit flaky and you want to go back to the previous one, you can always roll it back. Publish HII or H11 resources, enabled or disabled. I honestly don't know what that is, so I will leave that as it's set. ASUS Secure Erase, so that is for erasing SSDs. Yes, we do want to leave that. You also got ASUS user profiles, so you can set profiles for your settings, save those in there, and also reload them should you want to. SPD information, that's going to be reading from the DIMM slots, so you can choose which DIMM slot you're actually reading there, and if you're having problems you can check to make sure that both of your DIMMs are actually matched. That can sometimes be a problem. Also, you can read the settings off them, so the JDEC and the XMP settings, so you can manually put those in to the BIOS should you have issues with your memory. In this section you've got the option to download and install Armoury Crate app. So if you go into Windows 10 or Windows 11, when you're actually in the system, if you've not got Armoury Crate installed, there will be a pop-up on your screen saying, do you want to install and download Armoury Crate? You can choose that enabled or disabled. I would probably leave that disabled if you've seen any of my previous videos. That is pretty much it. The next one is going to be exit. So you've got the option for load optimized defaults, which probably for most people is going to be the best option. Or you can just do save, changes and reset. So it'll take you back into setting up your system or going back into Windows or even installing Windows. If you're not sure and maybe you've made some bad settings there, you can discard changes, press that and it will exit. And then you can also launch the UEFI shell from USB drive. So if you want to boot actually into Windows setup from that, you can do from there. So we're just going to do save, changes and resets, and it tells you all the settings that we've changed. Yep, that is pretty much it. You can scroll through just to make sure that you have done everything that you wanted to. So secure boot set as a standard, yeah, fast boot disabled, and disable Armoury Crate. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Click OK and it will save the settings and reboot back into your operating system. Okay, so there you go. There is a brief introduction to, well, it wasn't very brief, but you get the general idea, of the Prime H610M-K D4, DDR4. Quite a few settings in there that probably you don't necessarily need, but I guess it's nice to have them there as an option. Obviously, if you're buying like a pre-built system, the BIOSes on those are really locked down. There's not a great deal you can do, like Dell PCs, etc. So it's actually nice that ASUS, although they've locked down things like overclocking, they've still given you access to other things that you can tweak to improve your system performance. So anyway, there you go. That has been the BIOS on the ASUS H610M-K D4. I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.